Good evening, everybody. What a lovely large audience after you've had such a hard day and all of our liquid sunshine. This day today, the weather that you've experienced today, 79 years ago, people would have been so happy with it because the Luftwaffe wouldn't have been able to come and bomb Portsmouth, which they did on a regular basis. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the blitzes on London because we tend to believe there was just one of them, but there weren't. But bear in mind, when I'm talking about London, I'm talking about London because A, I'm a Londoner, and B, it's the bigger story. But most of the main industrial cities of the UK had the same treatment. And of course, we, the combined Allied offensive, meted out this sort of treatment to the whole of occupied Europe. As the resident historian told you when he talked about France itself, like Le Havre yesterday in Paris, not so much Paris, but Le Havre, was completely decimated. So whilst I'm talking about London, these sorts of raids happened on both sides, by both sides. Any of you who came to my Battle of Britain talk will know that this type of warfare was started by the Germans initially on Warsaw and then on Rotterdam. So it doesn't help much, but we always say they started it first. But there you go. As I talked about with the Battle of Britain, it wasn't as if we weren't ready for it. In the First World War, London had been bombed by large aeroplanes and Zeppelin airships. And some quite large disasters had happened. A school had been hit in the centre of London by a German aircraft with a couple of what would now be considered very small bombs, but it killed about 25 or 30 children. And the public were in uproar about it. And it signalled a new form of warfare, bombing from above. And the Prime Minister in the 1930s, Stanley Baldwin, is famous for saying that the bomber will always get through. The air, after all, covers 100% of the planet. So the whole idea that Great Britain would be bombed if we ever went to war again was in the uppermost minds of those who were planning for the next war. So preparations were important. And the first thing people realized in the cities was that the transportation system would be the best thing if you wanted to attack and stop a country from waging war. Hit that first. And the photograph on the left there is a 1938 photograph of the rush hour at Charing Cross Tube Station, which is just round the corner from Parliament Square in the centre of London. The UK in the 1930s and 40s, and actually up until the 1950s, was not a motorised society. Very few people had motor cars. People lived relatively near to where they worked. So they used the public transport or their bicycle, the buses, or in the case of London, the underground, the tube, to get to work. So this is what it looked like at Charing Cross during the rush hour. So if you could bomb a few railway stations or bomb a bit of railway track, you would be doing very well. And on the right there is preparations again, stockpiles of not just railway, I think you call them railway ties, we call them sleepers, wooden bits of wood that the rails sit on. They're also pit props in order to prop up the tubes if they got bombed, the underground tube lines. And you can see a tube train going through that. That's the sort of stockpiling that we were doing. We also realised that London was a city with a river going right through the middle of it. So not only did that mean that the Germans could find us quite easily, particularly on a moonlit night, it also meant that the system that we operated to provide transport could easily be flooded. So this is a tube map. How many of you have never been to London? A few people. Okay. London's metro, London's underground, is the oldest electric deep-level underground system in the world. 1860. And the first deep level bit was under the Thames, which is what the Northern Line, it's called the Northern Line now, and it's this black line here. And that was the very first electric deep level underground. And you can see the Thames. This map has got nothing to do with scale. It was designed by an electrical engineer and was copied then by metro systems and transportation systems all over the world. And it's a pretty well-known map. But the area that I've hatched out is the area that would have been completely flooded had any of these underground tunnels under the Thames had a direct hit from a German bomb. So we took preparations over that as well. We put hydrophones on the bed of the Thames River. And there was a control room in one of the tube stations where a man was 24 hours, 7 days a week, listening. And then if a bomb went off, we could close watertight doors on the tube system. They could be closed within a minute with a signal from him, all analog again, all done by the telephone system. And those doors could be closed. At the time of Munich in 1938, we had not yet put those in. So when we didn't know whether Hitler was going to go to war in 1938 over Czechoslovakia, we actually filled those tunnels with concrete in case we went to war. And it took 3 months to get the concrete out again. So we realized we needed to do something better. So we put these two types, the diaphragm type and the sliding type of. And believe it or not, they sat there until about 10 or 15 years ago. They've now been all through the Cold War, of course. So they've now been removed. So the preparations were totally fundamental. Preparations also, which you'll see in a moment, to evacuate all the vulnerable people out of the cities before the bombing started. But the war started 1st of September 1939. Hitler invades Poland. 3 days later, France and Britain, well, France a day after us actually, but 3 days later, we and France declare war on Germany.
We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall never surrender.
Winston Churchill again, of course. I'm afraid I looked like that when I was a little boy. That's what we all looked like. And we all had teachers that looked like that as well. And we all did as we were told. And when we were told, we used to have to hide under the desks because we had, in the UK during the Cold War, we had a 4-minute warning. That's all we had for an intercontinental ballistic missile. In the Second World War, we had the sirens, which you heard there, and the children were practicing pre-war their air raid drills. So the first things we had to think about was blacking out our cities and evacuating the vulnerable people. So this is a London Transport factory making headlight, I think you call them blinders, like what the horses wear when they race. We call them blinkers, and that's what they were called. And they were fitted to all the buses, all the cars that were working, and they basically dimmed down the lights of these vehicles only to the road just in front. We had painted white fenders on all the vehicles. There's a mesh on every window to stop blast. And of course, there's the gas mask. Everybody got a gas mask. It was by law, you had to carry a gas mask, whoever you were, all the time you were out. So the blackout was important. In the first 3 months of the Second World War, in the first year, very little happened. They call it the phony war because nothing much happened, certainly in Western Europe. More people were hurt in the blackout as a result of the blackout than by enemy action because nobody could see where they were going. All the street signs were taken down, so the enemy couldn't see where they were know where they were going if they invaded. So you couldn't find your way. The sign from London to Portsmouth, for example, would have been taken down. You would not have known how to get to Portsmouth unless you'd done it before. So the evacuation was also very important. The evacuation statistics are quite incredible. 2.1 million people were evacuated in 3 days. Children primarily. One London tube station alone, Ealing Broadway, which is at the west of London, in one single day evacuated 500,000 children. One station. Train after train after train. The bus drivers took them out into the country, or the double-decker buses were going off sometimes for a day to the destination, then a day back for the driver, and the drivers, of course, worked in the cities in which they were employed, and there were no road signs. So it was not easy, but it worked, and within a week, all the particularly children had been evacuated from the major cities, including London. The vulnerable people were sent to specific places. It's quite interesting. What they did was they put blind people in a particular city so that they could be looked after in an environment that they could understand. They put pregnant women went to particular centres where they could be looked after. Lunatics were spread around the country. Now there's sense for you, isn't it? That's pretty sensible. I don't think we're supposed to call them lunatics anymore, but that was the quotation. Lunatics are to be dispersed around the country. But these are children being evacuated. They're from the East End of London. A lot of them have got no socks. Many of them had no shoes. They're from very deprived areas. They don't have suitcases. They are carrying their worldly possessions in a pillowcase. And they were allowed one suitcase or pillowcase, one toy, and each of them had a label on them. And on their label, they had to write their name and their address. And they were put on the train or the bus by their mother. This is a female police officer supervising. And that was it. And in some cases, those parents didn't see those children again until the end of the war. A lot of them came home relatively quickly. A lot of them came home a year or so later. But an awful lot of mothers whose husbands were in the army and had been sent abroad rather liked being single again. And I have a couple of friends who never went home because mum didn't want them back. She'd got quite used to being a single girl again. Young mum, that sort of thing. So evacuation was a very mixed bag. But the public made the most of it. It must have been, we can all imagine, parents amongst us can imagine what it must have been like. But, of course, this is propaganda. You need to make sure that the public are behind what's going on.
The evacuation of British children is going on smoothly and efficiently. The Ministry of Health says that great progress has been made with the first part of the government's arrangements. Railways, the road transport organizations, the local authorities and teachers, the voluntary workers, and not least, the householders in the reception areas are all playing their parts splendidly.
That's, of course, what the people were told. And in the main, it was true. You would be designated as somebody who was going to have evacuees placed in your home based on the number of rooms you had, the number of beds you had, and so on. And there would be a knock on the door and there'd be two children there and you'd be told they were your responsibility. Storage. Works of art from all our museums and galleries were sent to various places, to caves in Wales, to deep level underground, disused underground tunnels, to the tin mines of Cornwall that we're going to tomorrow near Falmouth. This is them being returned to the Tate Gallery after the war by coming up from one of the deep level underground tubes that I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes, and they're being brought back to the Tate Gallery. This on the right, somebody saw this and thought it was a pile of dead bodies. It's not. It's a pile of people sleeping. They're sheltering. At the beginning of the war, we had built surface shelters, but not very many of them. And when the bombing first started, the tube company, London Transport, had no plans to allow the public into the tube system. But where did the public run to? As soon as the bombs started falling, they ran to the tube stations and they found them locked. And it took about 2 days before the government to realise that they couldn't stop the public using the tube. So the Tube became the biggest air raid shelter in London. There were others, but this is an example. And this is when it was disorganised. I'll show you in a moment what it was like when it was organised. As you've heard, some of you who may have been to the Resident Historians Round Table on Women at War, as soon as the UK went to war, everybody was involved. There was no gender discrimination in terms of jobs. Everybody either had a voluntary job that they did when they were not at work, or they were taken on as skilled labour in what had previously been gender-specific jobs. And this is line-side work, track maintenance by, and you can see that the woman is doing some wiring, helped by probably a qualified tradesman who is teaching her the job on the London Underground. Also, we had a whole new tube system being built at the time called the Central Line. And those of you who've been to London, that's the red one that runs from west to east. Well, unless you're going in the opposite direction, and then it goes from east to west. But either way, it goes horizontally across London. And it's a long one. But at that time, a very large extension, 10-mile extension, had not yet been opened, and had not yet been open to the public. So it was turned into a factory. And you can see the factory, it is a tube underground line. It had its own medical staff. There are 2 nurses. It had a narrow gauge railway running down it. And all the parts for these machine tools that these primarily women are operating were brought in these boxes along this narrow gauge railway. And they're making instruments for aircraft. They're making things like fuel pumps, oil pumps, small items for the aircraft industry, optical items for bomb sites and all that sort of things. Germans had no idea that this system existed. This is a cutaway of it, but you can see street level, they had special entrances for the workers, and then this whole network, all the way down, had different types of factory for over 10 miles under London, using a tube system that hadn't yet opened. Prior to the war, bus conductors had primarily been male. As soon as the war started, they took on females to act as bus conductors. And they were called Clippies because they clipped your ticket. And these became a great favourite with American servicemen when they came over after Pearl Harbor, these ladies, because they could talk. They wouldn't have any messing around on the bus. They would make you pay, they would make you sit where you were supposed to, and so on. And they would tell you where you were, because again, the street names were taken down and things like that. So if you wanted to know where you were, only the Clippy would be able to tell you. But this is, I think I've got time, because I love this, because when I found this out, I was amazed. These are 2 training photographs. Anybody know anything about the bell punch ticket system? It's an American system. We used it. Okay, bell punch ticket system. Quick explanation of it. She's giving tickets to people in the carriage, and she's been given instruction here. And this is her ticket machine, and there are her tickets. And in those days, the tickets were all different colours, and they were sort of a thinnish. They were made thinner during the war for economy reasons, but they were sort of card. Now, the instructions is the right way. Left hand holds the rack. That's the rack of tickets. Thumb on the punch trigger up here. Oops, let's go back, sorry. Let's go back. Whoops-a-daisy. And right hand free to insert the ticket. So the ticket is inserted there, and the thumb is going to press that button. When she presses that button, a little tiny rod comes down on the ticket and puts a hole in it. And she then gives the ticket to the customer. And the customer then has their valid, paid-for ticket. She puts the money in her leather pouch. They all go off, and she carries on with her duty. He gets, or she gets off of the bus at wherever their destination is. And how do you account for the money and the ticket sold? She goes back to the garage, and at the end of her tour of duty, she takes that machine off her leather straps that are around her, and the tickets that are left on, and she pushes them through like a bank cashier's window tiny little window with bars on it. And she gives it with her number to the person behind. And then in that is a room about this size behind. And in that room are tables with women sitting at it, only women. And they get each of the machines into a little tray in front of them on the box, and they undo them. They have a lead seal and a wire cover, so she can't touch it. They undo the lead seal, they knock, and all the tiny little pinhead dots of the tickets fall onto the table in front of her. She then separates them all into the different colours, which she then knows what's been paid for by the colour of the ticket. She then sees how many tickets are left in the ticket and analyses that and reconciles it in terms of what the Clippy has taken for that journey, and writes the account and moves on, reseals the thing for the next person to use. Could only use women because very few women are colourblind. It's a male thing. And to do that job, you had to have good, very good colour vision. We also went into a lot of saving of resources. Sort of the climate protest at the moment could learn an awful lot from this. First of all, we changed the use of materials. Rubber was very difficult to come by. The seat moquettes of public transport vehicles were changed. We parked our buses in the centre of London between the two rush hours. We didn't drive them all the way back to the garage. We left them where they were going to be needed for everybody going home. We ran our buses on a form of coal gas. It wasn't particularly efficient, and there are lots of reports of people having to get out of the bus and push it uphill. There's a place called Shooters Hill in South London where this happened regularly, but it saved on gasoline, which was very, very important. The Blitz itself started in September 1940 to May 1941, and there was 56 consecutive days and nights of bombing. Those of you who came to my talk on the Battle of Britain stopped the invasion, but during the Battle of Britain, one of the German aircraft came over and accidentally dropped its load above the cloud. It didn't know where it was. The pilot was trying to go home, and he made a navigational error, and he dropped bombs on the outskirts of London. Churchill then immediately demanded a retaliatory raid on Berlin. Both of the raids were minuscule compared to what happened a few years later. But either way, Hitler was infuriated, and that made a change of tactics. Instead of the German Luftwaffe being required to beat the Royal Air Force to provide air supremacy for an invasion, Hitler demanded that the bombers from the Luftwaffe should attack London, which might have affected London very badly, but it saved us from invasion, along with those young pilots of the defending aeroplanes. And that started in September, initially during the daylight, which those of you who came to the Battle of Britain talk, you saw my father talking about bailing out and getting very badly burnt. That was during a daylight raid on London. But once their losses got so high during the day, they started to bomb at night. And day and night, they bombed for 56. In 1940-41, these are the scenes. This is Sloane Square Station. It had just been refurbished with new elevators, escalators, and that's after November the 12th, 1940. That's what it looked like afterwards. This was a terrible disaster. This is a double-decker bus in Balham High Road on the 15th of October, 1940. This bomb has gone into the ticket hall, and it's also ruptured a water main. And this is the result downstairs on the tube platform, with the clock stopped at 2 minutes past 8 on the 14th of October 1940, and the debris lying. 4 railwaymen and 64 people who were sheltering were killed. That one bomb that came through. The tube system became a huge air raid shelter, so it had to be formalised. It was formalised in such a way that initially wooden bunks were assembled on the platforms. And the railway platform the railway platforms on the tube are about 10 feet wide. 6 feet was allocated to sheltering and the rest was for passing up and down the platform. And the idea was to put these bunks in and people could sleep there. And initially the bunks were made of wood. Trouble was there's an awful lot of vermin and rats in the underground. Next time any of you in London, just look down into where the track is and you'll see a little black rat or mouse run past you. So they thought the wooden bunks are a wonderful source of food for them. So they started to eat them. So these are metal bunks, and the station is Holborn, as you can see. And these people would have an assigned bunk with a ticket to get into the shelter. And every night, London Transport, the last train of the night before the electricity was turned off to the track, because people then slept on top of the track as well, a refreshment service would run the whole length of the line that people were sheltering on, and they would serve 120,000 shelterers each night, these ladies, all volunteers, all the food cooked in the canteens of the railway company and provided by the railway company for the shelterers. A lot was made of the sheltering, particularly at Christmas time, because they would have Christmas decorations and Christmas trees, and particularly Christmas 1940-41, the height of the first Blitz. And they're giving out buns and cocoa and so on. Obviously, these are posed photographs, and obviously everybody is smiling, and obviously everything wasn't as fantastic as these photographs might make out. But from my researches, what I have discovered is that it was not an unhappy time. They made communities down there. Some tube stations had their own newsletter, used to produce it every week, and it was distributed amongst them, and they would write articles for it. They held classes down there. They had medical care. We didn't have any national health system in those days, but they could actually get seen by a nurse or even a doctor when they were in the shelters. We thought after the Blitz, the first Blitz, that we needed to do better and do deep level ones. So we started to dig during the calm when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. We had a period of calm where nothing much happened. And lots of the children came home. And we decided we'd build much deeper and bigger shelters, especially for the civilians. There was an ulterior motive that the government weren't told about, but the transportation company offered to do it because they wanted to build a high-speed train link after the war, and they were going to get the government to pay for a whole load of it by digging these deeper tunnels. But they didn't tell the government that. These are the stations that were used, and they were basically huge tunnels underneath existing tunnels, so they could use the access and then just make greater access below them. And I've put in parentheses next to them some company names. They were sponsored. The shelters were sponsored by the company that was above them. For example, Chancery Lane, which the Prudential Insurance Company building is now a huge hotel, very nice hotel in London, but the company actually provided the money and the volunteers and the support for the deep level station. And that's what they looked like. They were massive. They've got some children climbing down. They were further down. You have the standard tunnel here, and then the big tunnel underneath. And they were massive structures, hardly ever used. They weren't needed that much, but you can still see evidence of them on the surface in London to this day. That's one in Golders Green. When I was director of the London Transport Museum, we used to keep our nitrate film, which is highly inflammable stuff and has to be kept in a cool and stable environment. We used to keep our nitrate film in one of these old deep tunnels. They're also used in the Cold War as control centres. The one under Chancery Lane is still secret. I've been in there. It's got lovely posters still from the Second World War in there. They were used for various purposes. During the coronation of our Queen in 1953, then the Victory Parade in 1945, all the soldiers that came from all over the world to participate were put up in these deep shelters because they had accommodation. That's what they look like today. with a double floor. The idea was that that floor would be taken out, and this would have been the track bed if they had ever built that high-speed railway they were going to build. And this is the sort of thing they're used for today, for storage, and they're nearly all now privately owned. I talked earlier about saving things. We waste not, want not. These are stretchers that we used, or gurneys, I think you call them, for injured people. And if you look at that carefully, you can see that is the fence being used around a new build just after the war. So those were used again. The Baedeker raids followed in April and May 1942. It was after the Royal Air Force had bombed a beautiful northern German city called Lübeck, a beautiful Hanseatic League city, wooden framed buildings. He said, "There is no other way of bringing the English to their senses. They belong to a class of human beings with whom you can only talk after you have first knocked out their teeth." So what he did was he took the Baedeker guide, sort of the guide of the time, like the Michelin guide, but for properties, and he told his generals to bomb the cities. So cities like York, Bath were bombed just because they had beautiful historic buildings in them. Everybody walked through the rubble to get to work. The worst disaster in the civilian disaster in the Second World War happened during these lives. During this time, 173 men and women lost their lives in one of the shelters. It wasn't actually through German action. We had invented a new type of anti-aircraft gun. And when it went off, nobody had heard this before, and they rushed the shelter. And it was a crushing accident. As they all ran down the stairs, somebody fell, and the people that followed them were killed. Crushing. These are the big cities that were attacked. And then a baby blitz. They decided that they would, as propaganda for their own people really, just start bombing us again between January and May 1944. The revenge attacks for the amount of bombings that the combined bombing offensive of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force was doing to them. And it was a propaganda exercise. All it did was exhaust German resources. Its impact on the UK was not that great. We had much better defences by that time, so we shot an awful lot down. Then the last Blitz happened a week and a day after D-Day, when the first V-1s started to land on London. And that's the V-1 on the left. And there was a warning with that. We called it the doodle bug, or the buzz bomb, because it had a motor that buzzed, and when you heard the engine stop, it would pitch down and you knew that the bomb was going to go off. The V2 on the right, first ballistic missile, that came in and nobody knew it was going to come at all. And that first landed on a suburb of London called Chiswick in 1944. And there was no defence against that when it was after it had been launched. So what we did was we mounted attacks on the bases. I don't expect you to gain anything from the two pictures except the red dots. You can see the River Thames. So that's the River Thames in blue. Those red dots are V1 strikes on London. So it was quite intense, and it was a terrifying period of time. And these are the sites in France that we attacked in what was called Operation Crossbow, a coordinated attack against the Vengeance weapons. And of course, the way to stop them was to actually get them before they'd been launched. And that's what we eventually managed to do. As the Allies advanced and as the reconnaissance aircraft first would pick out where they were, and then they would be attacked by ground attack aircraft like the British Typhoon or the American Thunderbolt or Mustang. So this is a post-war photograph of the V2s when they're being examined by the Allies, and of course they formed the basis of the first space rockets. So did it work? Well, it's interesting that certainly the morale of the British people was never dented to such an extent that it had any adverse effect on the war. And indeed, I don't believe the morale of the German people was affected by our campaign against them that adversely affected the war at all. What it did do was it diverted huge amounts of resource from the military of both sides to either defending or clearing up the mess that had been left by strategic bombing. The V-weapons form the basis of modern cruise missiles. These publicity photographs are just, well, propaganda photographs are just wonderful, but they reflect the attitude of the people at the time. In order to ensure that the US was aware of what was going on, a film was made directly directed at the United States by Collier's Weekly. It was called London Can Take It, and Quentin Reynolds is going to narrate it, and I'd like you to see it all because it's one of the nicest documentaries that was done of the Second World War. There was a couple of better ones, but this is one of the best, and it's 9 minutes.
I'm speaking from London. It is late afternoon, and the people of London are preparing for the night. Everyone is anxious to get home before darkness falls, before our nightly visitors arrive. This is the London rush hour. Many of the people at whom you are looking now are members of the greatest civilian army ever to be assembled. These men and women who have worked all day in offices or in markets are now hurrying home to change into the uniform of their particular service. The dusk is deepening. Listening crews are posted all the way from the coast to London to pick up the drone of the German planes. Soon the nightly battle of London will be on. This has been a quiet day for us, but it won't be a quiet night. We haven't had a quiet night now for more than 5 weeks. They'll be over tonight. They'll destroy a few buildings and kill a few people, probably some of the people you are watching now. Now they're going into the public shelters. This is not a pleasant way to spend the night, but the people accept it as their part in the defense of London. These civilians are good soldiers. Now it's 8 o'clock. Jerry is a little bit late tonight. The searchlights are in position. The guns are ready. The People's Army of Volunteers is ready. They are the ones who are really fighting this war. The firemen, the air raid wardens, the ambulance drivers. And there's the wail of the banshee. The nightly siege of London has begun. The city is dressed for battle. Here they come. Now the searchlights are poking long, white, inquisitive fingers into the blackness of the night. Hollywood sound effects. This is the music they play every night in London, the Symphony of War. That was a bomb. very young and the very old, with that deep wisdom given only to the very young and the very old, sleep in the shelters. Do you see any signs of fear on these faces? Now the army of the people swings into action. The bombs have started fires. When a bomber starts a fire, he immediately returns, uses it as a target, and drops more bombs, hoping to spread the fire. Yet the people's army ignores the bombs and the spent shrapnel which rains down constantly. Brokers, clerks, peddlers, merchants by day, they are heroes by night. The night is long, but sooner or later the dawn will come. The German bombers are creatures of the night. They melt away before the dawn and scurry back to the safety of their own airdromes. And there's the wail of the banshee again, this time a friendly wail. The all-clear signal tells us that the bombers have gone. It's just 6 a.m. In this last hour of precious sleep, this strange new world finds peace. London raises her head, shakes the debris of the night from her hair, and takes stock of the damage done. London has been hurt during the night. The sign of a great fighter in the ring is, can he get up from the floor after being knocked down? London does this every morning. London doesn't look down upon the ruins of its houses, upon those made homeless during the night, upon the remains of churches, hospitals, workers' flats. London looks upwards toward the dawn and faces the new day with calmness and confidence. The people's army go to work as they did in that other comfortable world which came to an end when the invader began to attack the last strongholds of freedom. Not all the services run as they did yesterday, but London manages to get to work on time, one way or another. In the center of the city, the shops are open as usual. In fact, many of them are more open than usual. Dr. Paul Joseph Gibbles said recently that the nightly air raids have had a terrific effect upon the morale of the people of London. The good doctor is absolutely right. Today the morale of the people is higher than ever before. They are fused together, not by fear, but by a surging spirit of courage the like of which the world has never known. They know that thousands of them will die, but they would rather stand up and face death than kneel down and face the kind of existence the conqueror would impose upon them. And they know, too, and are comforted by the thought that England is not taking its beating lying down. They are guarding the frontiers of freedom. It is hard to see 5 centuries of labor destroyed in 5 seconds. But London is fighting back. I am a neutral reporter. I have watched the people of London live and die ever since death in its most ghastly garb began to come here as a nightly visitor 5 weeks ago. I have watched them stand by their homes. I have seen them made homeless. I have seen them moved to new homes. And I can assure you, there is no panic, no fear, no despair in London town. There is nothing but determination, confidence, and high courage among the people of Churchill's Island. And they know that every night the RAF bombers fly deep into the heart of Germany, bombing munition works, airplane factories, canals, cutting the arteries which keep the heart of Germany alive. It is true that the Nazis will be over again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night. They will drop thousands of bombs, and they'll destroy hundreds of buildings, and they'll kill thousands of people. But a bomb has its limitations. It can only destroy buildings and kill people. It cannot kill the unconquerable spirit and courage of the people of London. London can take it.
I wish politicians would look at history a bit more closely. Europe currently thinks that Britain wouldn't go it on its own. It's highly likely it will. London Transport is one of the great art museums of the world, because inside those tube stations and on those underground railway platforms were works of art by some fantastic Art Deco graphic artists, and this one, of course, encapsulates what I've been saying today all. London Transport carried on as it did indeed. And there's this lovely photograph here of these three little ones sitting here. This is what children looked like in those days. As I said, I look much like that at that age. London carried on, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.